We're going to examine a particular type of control system, one that functions without any overt application of force. Now, when we think about control, we usually picture explicit acts, coercion, direct commands, maybe the threat of violence from some clear authority, but that perception, you see, is out of step with how complex modern systems actually operate. They've moved beyond those kinds of inefficient methods. On the left, you see the traditional model of control. It's confrontational, it's inefficient, and it's energetically expensive. On the right, you see the mechanisms that have largely replaced it. Here, control is achieved not through a direct fight, but through the establishment of routines that normalize behavior. It works through subtle environmental and social pressures that guide our choices, and it cultivates a tendency in us to correct ourselves. A system that has to rely on constant force is, by its very nature, unstable. It just invites resistance. But modern systems achieve stability by making control all but invisible. And this is the core principle of this modern architecture. The most effective, the most durable forms of control are the ones that are not even recognized as control by the people inside the system. Compliance is secured most effectively when the individual believes they are acting out of their own free will. The structure isn't designed to compel you, it's designed to incline you. It makes the desired behavior feel like the most logical, the most natural, or simply the most convenient choice available. And that just eliminates the need for any kind of enforcement. So let's examine the first and most fundamental mechanism here, the management of choice. We're going to look at how the subjective feeling of freedom is manufactured and then maintained, even inside a fundamentally constrained environment. This brings us to a key concept, perceived autonomy. It's really the cornerstone of invisible control. It describes that psychological state where you feel empowered because you can make decisions, but you don't recognize that the menu of options you have to choose from has been carefully curated and limited in advance. The system gives you the feeling of agency, but only within prescribed boundaries that don't threaten its own structure. This creates a state of freedom that is satisfying, but ultimately inconsequential. And here's how that applies in practice. The system presents a menu of choices: which career path to follow from a pre-approved list, which consumer goods to buy, which social identity to adopt. These choices give you a sense of movement, of progress, of self-determination. They occupy your focus, but the one choice that is never on the menu is the choice to reject the system itself. Participation is not optional. This really gets to the heart of the paradox. The simple cognitive act of choosing between option A, B, or C satisfies our very human desire for autonomy. And that engagement, that process of choosing, effectively distracts from the fact that the walls of the system are inescapable. You can think of it like this. There are many corridors, and the act of walking down them feels like freedom, but they all exist inside the same building, and the exits to that building are sealed. Okay, now let's move on to the structural tools used to guide behavior. This is the architecture of compliance itself. It's built not on punishment, but on the strategic management of incentives, the engineered creation of scarcity, and the systematic application of debt. You see, overt threats are clumsy and unnecessary when a system can just carefully align its incentives with its desired outcomes. Through what we can call incentive harmonization, the system is engineered to naturally and automatically reward behaviors that supports its own continuity. And conversely, it indirectly punishes behaviors that challenge it. Nothing has to be explicitly forbidden. It's simply made prohibitively expensive, or difficult, or socially isolating. Here we see the specific rewards and consequences in action. Conforming behavior, system-supportive behavior, is met with stability, a predictable future, and access to resources. This provides a powerful, constant incentive to stay on the prescribed path. Deviant behavior, on the other hand, is met not with physical force, but with instability, a volatile existence, and exclusion from the system's benefits. The punishment isn't a single event, it's a chronic state of disadvantage. Scarcity is another powerful tool for psychological conditioning. Whether it's a scarcity of time, energy, or resources, it has a specific effect. When your cognitive load is consumed by the demands of immediate survival, your capacity for abstract, long-term analysis of the system itself is severely diminished. This induced state, the compliance bias, ensures that you don't question the design of the game when all your available energy is required simply to play it. And then there's debt. Debt functions as a form of temporal control. It anchors your future to a predetermined path. An initial obligation immediately constrains your choices in the near future. As time goes on and the payments continue, this constraint solidifies your trajectory, reinforcing compliant behavior.
Eventually, so much has been invested in this one path that any significant deviation becomes practically and psychologically impossible. The future is, in effect, converted into collateral before it even arrives.
So we've looked at the external structures. Now the focus shifts inward, to the mechanisms within the individual and the group. This section examines how external control gets internalized, how its constraints come to be seen as normal, and why it is so often vigorously defended by the very people it contains. Through repetition and constancy, conditions that might have once been seen as restrictive just become the baseline for normal experience. This is adaptive compliance. Routines form, expectations adjust, and what was once a persistent pressure just becomes imperceptible background noise. The constraints of the system cease to be noticed because they have become the unquestioned environment, as natural as the air itself. And this is the political consequence of that adaptive compliance. When a population no longer struggles against its constraints, because those constraints are no longer perceived as constraints, the system appears to be functioning on the basis of free will. The lack of an overt struggle is then interpreted by both observers and participants as evidence of consent and liberty, rather than as what it is, evidence of successful normalization. A central authority is a very inefficient way to police the daily behavior of a large population. So, control is made scalable and cost-effective through something called horizontal enforcement. The system essentially outsources the task of regulation to the population itself. Individuals monitor one another, enforcing compliance not through legal codes, but through the far more pervasive and immediate tools of social pressure. The instruments of this peer-to-peer enforcement are psychological. First, deviation from the accepted norm is met with the swift judgment of one's peers. Second, a culture of constant comparison, of success, of lifestyle, of behavior, reinforces the accepted standard. And third, the primary punishment for non-compliance isn't imprisonment, but the loss of social status, which is a powerful motivator for conformity in a social species. And this brings us to a paradox. Individuals often become the most ardent defenders of the very systems that constrain them. This is the system justification bias. To question the fundamental logic of the system is to simultaneously question the validity of your own life, your choices, the sacrifices you've made within it. This creates a profound psychological dissonance. And so, it's often cognitively easier to just defend the system than to confront the possibility that your lifelong efforts have been misdirected inside a flawed structure. Finally, let's examine the ultimate purpose of this complex architecture. If the goal isn't simple domination for its own sake, then what is the objective of such a pervasive yet invisible system of control? Well, the common assumption is that the motive for control is a desire for power or domination. The actual function, however, is something far more pragmatic: predictability. Large-scale systems, economic, corporate, political, they all require a stable and forecastable environment to function effectively. Human behavior is the single largest variable. The purpose of this architecture of compliance is to reduce that variability, making the population manageable and its behavior predictable. The old model of control is simply inefficient for this purpose. The application of overt force inevitably creates resistance. Resistance leads to conflict, and conflict creates instability and disruption, the very outcomes a large-scale system seeks to avoid. Force, therefore, is a tool of last resort. It's a signal of systemic failure. The modern model, on the other hand, based on seemingly voluntary compliance, is vastly more efficient. When individuals regulate themselves and each other, all while believing they're acting freely, the system achieves a state of smooth, uninterrupted continuity. It operates with minimal friction and maximum predictability. To conclude, let's summarize the experience from the inside. Through the process of adaptive compliance, the boundaries of the system simply cease to feel like constraints. They become the unquestioned, ordinary landscape of reality. And through the mechanism of perceived autonomy, the act of conforming to the system's designated path doesn't feel like obedience at all. It feels like a series of personal decisions, freely made. The most effective systems, you see, don't need to demand your obedience. They are designed to cultivate it as a personal preference. If control no longer needs force, how would you recognize it when it is already working?